of content, and what you'll often find is that it's harder to do. Hi, and welcome to Lesson 1 of Building a Basic Website. I'm Brian McDermott from the UMass Amherst Journalism Program, and today we're going to talk about aesthetic graphic design. Before we do, though, let's take a look at how to use this website that you're on right now. Every Monday and Thursday, I'll post a new lesson to umass.edu/journalism/MOOC. You can complete these lessons at your own pace, going step by step through the videos and readings. When you're ready, the enrolled users can use this link at the bottom of the page to log back into Moodle and to complete the assignment for that lesson. Design is visual, of course, and so one definition of good design is work that's aesthetically pleasing and nice to look at. But design is also about functionality and making sure that the information is conveyed in the most intuitive and effective way possible. For web designers, you're building a site for a space about the size of a piece of notebook paper, and that's if you're lucky. According to Pew, 17% of adults get their internet primarily from their cell phones, a much smaller space. So how are we going to meet that challenge of designing for such small spaces? Well, let's start by learning the vocabulary designers use to talk about what they do. Composition is the term we use to talk about how visual elements are arranged within the page. I might say a composition is busy, meaning elements of the page are haphazardly arranged and it's hard to know where to focus. Or I might say a website has a clean composition, meaning the aesthetics are simplified and easy to process visually. Hierarchy is a graphic design term that concerns how the viewer interacts with the composition of a page, what they look at first, for example. The best design is intentional, and it communicates to the viewer where the focus should be and how a person interacts with each visual element. So I might say, the hierarchy of this page is strong because this big picture draws my attention, the logo type font's bigger than what's less important, and the navigation is at a point on the page where I'm likely to find it quickly. Sometimes the easiest way to understand hierarchy is to see a lack of it. Craigslist, for example, doesn't really have an appealing hierarchy. Where's your eye supposed to fall? Negative space is another important concept in graphic design. You don't need to over-design and fill in every spot with content. And what you'll often find is that it's harder to do a good, restrained, minimal design than it is to do a busy one. Designers can and do have strong opinions on fonts and typography. Books are written about type, and graphic designers pay hundreds of dollars sometimes for a particularly fine font. Font types are divided into several broad categories: serif fonts, which have adornments on their edges, and sans serif fonts that don't. Google Fonts is a great resource for you to find free open-source fonts that you can use on your web page. As you'll soon discover, most websites are built using the box model, which means designs are made by arranging boxes like the header, the main content area, the sidebar, the footer, and so forth. If you know that, and you also now know terms like hierarchy and negative space, you're ready to start perusing websites with an informed eye for what works in terms of aesthetic design. We're going to crowdsource your impressions on web design. I'd like you to find a site you think showcases great design and another one that you think is pretty bad. Those enrolled in the interactive class can log in now to complete the assignment. You can also visit the class Pinterest page for inspiration from me and later on from your classmates. During the next lesson, we'll take a look at the crowd's opinion and we'll talk about navigation and functional design. We'll see you in Lesson 2. For your first assignment, you are going to look for websites you think are really well designed and also not so well designed. Let's talk about two websites I think are really nicely designed, and just as importantly, websites that you could conceivably make after learning the skills we're going to learn in this class. And so the first website is Liliana Pereira. You can see an interview with Liliana below. She's a graphic designer, and what I like about this website are a couple of things. First, we learn the term hierarchy, and here's a great example of it. The hierarchy here is clear. Your eye is drawn immediately to this rotating jQuery slideshow. That makes a lot of sense. Lily's a graphic designer, and so she wants her work to do the heavy lifting visually. There's a lot of negative space, another term we talked about. You can see there's some healthy room between the logo and this very subtle line. There's some healthy space between these three links below. The color choice is small c conservative, not politically conservative. This nice blue turquoise is matched by the rollover color. The navigation itself is quite simple. There's only 4 options. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that Lily has some links to social media. So a very simple, straightforward website, but also a very professional looking website. So along those same lines, this is a website for a production company called Furlined. I came across this website in Communication Arts magazine. And what I like about this is it's unique, but it's also simple. I looked at how this was built, and conceivably it's something that you can build by the end of this class. We talked about the box model in the first lesson, and the way this works is, to simplify a little bit, there's a box up here that contains the menu. There's a box that contains this fun typographic F with a comma. There's a box here that contains this table with all the names of the members, and then there's a box here for the footer. The hierarchy here is well done because the F, because of its color and because of its placement and its size, really draws your attention. It's easy to choose the member of the production collective that you want once you get there. It's very visual, also fairly simple. You click on it, you can watch their videos. To sum up, those are two websites with clean compositions that are simple and yet very professional and within your power to build by the end of this class.
My name is Lily Pereira. I've been doing graphic design for about 11 years now. I went to the Hartford Art School at the University of Hartford and studied visual communication design. I was part of an agency for most of that time, a little over 9 years, and now I'm out on my own doing my own work, and it's great. I think what makes for a really successful website is just clean, simple, easy to use. I just remember back in the day when the internet was kind of in its infancy. I just remember splash pages and all these entry points that were just kind of an exercise in futility, like just people being fancy and people just wanted to get to what they wanted. And as a user, that's how you have to think about the design of a website, how people are going to use it. And I think simplicity, being able to find things, hierarchy, nothing fancy, nothing flashy. I think people just need easy. In the arts, I think design is the only field where you're using your creativity for someone else. It is not your own personal aesthetic that you're trying to attain. You're trying to, and it's not really someone else's aesthetic either. You have to be true to whatever you're trying to communicate, or the brand, or whatever it's called. Why is design important? It's important because I think the mistake that people make about design is that they think it's mostly about making stuff pretty, and it's definitely not about that. There's an aesthetic quality to design, definitely, but it's very much about communication and communicating effectively and solving problems. And all these things are really, really important.
There's no law against bad design, which you know if you've spent any time on the internet. The ways a website can be bad, to paraphrase the book Anna Karenina, are all unhappy in their own unique way. But they all spring from one basic conundrum, and that's that you need a lot of information in a very small space. Dealing with that problem will be something you devote a lot of time to. Anyone who builds a website does. Talk to any graphic designer and he or she will tell you that they often feel this tension in meetings with clients. What's the point of aesthetics for aesthetics' sake, the client might say. I want every word of these 3 pages of text on the page and no negative space. You can read an interview below with New York Times graphics editor Amanda Cox where she talks about this balancing act. Design is important and often undervalued, but it's not the end of the road either. It's the content itself that matters most. The best designers are able to strike a balance between the content they need and the aesthetic design that they want. Crucially, they use these aesthetics to communicate quickly and strike the right tone. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at the New York Times website and the New York Times T-Style magazine. Although both are part of the same news outlet, the design is very different. The purpose of the news website is to report all the most important news worldwide. That's a big task and helps explain why the composition is so busy. The T-Style magazine, on the other hand, reports on design and aesthetics, and so it makes sense that the priority is more on establishing a hierarchy and creating nice negative space and graphics. Aesthetic design is ultimately subjective, based on personal preference and on culture. If you think of the 1980s, for example, there's a series of associated colors, fonts, and aesthetic styles. But these aesthetics turn into a type of functionality, and I'll give you a silly but apt example by looking at the website of 2 CIAs. One is the Central Intelligence Agency, and the other is the Culinary Institute of America. It's fair to say they have very different audiences that inform the design choices they made. The friendly color palette, fonts, and clear hierarchy of the cooking school serve to attract potential students. The quantity of links and lack of attention to both elaboration and modern-looking aesthetics on the CIA site gives the impression that they're a little bureaucratic and definitely limited in what content they want to share. But imagine putting the fonts and color scheme of the cooking school onto the spy agency's website. It wouldn't work at all to our eye. Whether we realize it or not, the composition and design choices of a page are major players in the success of the message. Of interest to us now is the functional side of good design, and it boils down to good hierarchy and good navigation. Good navigation in web design means your menus, headlines, and content are edited and presented in the most intuitive way possible. Bad navigation means that it's hard for the user to find what he or she is looking for. You can watch the videos below for a more detailed discussion about different navigation styles. It's better to edit very tightly than to try to include too many navigation options. For example, you might not need a separate About Me page if you put your contact information or a short bio on your front page. As you chart out your own hierarchy in site architecture, think about creating sections where you might send users directly, rather than hoping a user will click around on your site. For example, on my own website, I have a section for photojournalism and another for teaching, and I would share those direct links depending on my audience, rather than the more generic front page. We'll see you in lesson 3. A simple, really important point that Lily Pereira made in her interview and we made here in lesson 2 is that form and function are often one and the same in web design. Making smart aesthetic decisions is about communicating effectively. And so if you make smart choices in terms of aesthetics, it often means you've made smart functional choices for your audience viewing the website and doing justice to the content itself you put on your website. A good way to see this is to use the example of 2 different arts websites, starting with the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. And if we go through the aesthetic choices the designer made here, starting with the colors, you'll see that they all have a functional component. So this bright pink, bright blue, bright purple, bright green are of course colors that Andy Warhol himself used in his painting. And so that is a smart way to communicate the message, the content of the website itself. We have this nice pink highlight color, advancement of the visual arts, which of course is a good tagline for what this overall site is about. You also see that the hierarchy they chose, this very big revolving picture that's always Andy Warhol, that's an aesthetic choice in terms of how to make the hierarchy, but of course it also gets the point across that this is the Andy Warhol Foundation, and it does so quite quickly. Compare this arts website with the site of the Louvre, the famous French museum. And you can see the Louvre also has a hierarchy in which they've used a revolving slideshow to draw attention to some of what they consider most important. But everything else about this site is quite different. The fonts, for example, this serif font, the color palette is much more muted, and the tone is really quite different. It makes sense that the composition for the Louvre website is a little bit busier, considering that this is a museum representing many different artists in many different eras. It's serving an audience of potential visitors and curators and art enthusiasts, whereas the Warhol website is really talking about a single artist. One thing you can do to see this idea of how aesthetic choices set the tone for a website is to go look at the website of your favorite musician, and then pick a second website that's a musician that's a very different genre. And then look at those 2 websites side by side and think about how fonts, color choices, even things like hierarchy, how much negative space you use, these very simple aesthetic choices we've been making, think about how those play into the overall tone and feel and ultimate success in communicating the message of the website.